This is a clip from the Metropolitan Opera's 2023 staging of Don Giovanni, directed by Ivo van Hove and starring Peter Mattei and Ying Fang. It was posted to Instagram in April of last year, shot during dress rehearsals in the days leading up to the premiere. It's a simple video, mainly relying on a single mid-range shot that captures both singers in the vertical frame. I remember seeing it on my feed, and then it lived in the back of my mind for about 6 months. Then, in October, it shot back to the forefront when the Met posted this clip. This clip, featuring more polished, dynamic camera angles, was from the recording of the opera watched in movie theaters through the Met's Live in HD series, and newly available for at-home streaming. Same opera, same production, same singers, same duet, different films. Naturally, it was a perfect opportunity for comparison. For instance, when Zerlina walks away from Don Giovanni in the rehearsal footage, we get a side angle of her all alone. In the polished recording, she walks toward the camera with the Don behind her, followed by a cut to her in close-up. As Don Giovanni approaches in the following line, the rehearsal shows him in a wide shot, emphasizing the distance between the two, while the Live in HD recording keeps him in the background just behind Zerlina, her expression giving greater focus and his domineering presence emphasized by the unclear distance between the two. All this to say that there's more than one way to film the same opera. The decisions made while capturing a theatrical production on film can have a measurable impact on how the audience perceives the experience. Viewers of the rehearsal footage see the Don closing the distance between him and Zerlina, but viewers of the Live in HD recording see him always just behind her, his seduction turned from a pursuit to an inevitability. But to really explore this phenomenon, we need a better comparison than two 90-second clips. What we need are two full-length pro-shot recordings of the same staging of the same opera. Then I could watch them back to back to judge how their different uses of film language create two distinct viewing experiences. And if you clicked on this video, then you already know which opera I picked. La Fille du Régiment is a comic opera from 1840, with a score by Gaetano Donizetti. While there have been numerous productions of it across the 19th and 20th centuries, its 21st century history has been largely dominated by one version. Laurent Pelly's 2007 staging for the Royal Opera in London. The Pelly staging, comprising the scenic design, costumes, blocking, choreography, and acting beats, has been revived worldwide, continuing to be used by companies for their local productions of the opera up to today. Such is its omnipresence that, as mentioned, it has been filmed more than once over the years. So, last fall, I watched two recordings back to back. The original 2007 Royal Opera production, starring Natalie Dessay and Juan Diego Flores, and the 2019 Metropolitan Opera revival, starring Priti Yende and Javier Camarena. Different casts, different companies, 12 years of distance, and yet both can claim to be the Laurent Pelly staging of La Fille du Régiment. But, as it turns out, I had the opportunity to take this one step further. I mentioned that the Pelly staging is still used by opera companies up to today. Well, one of the companies to borrow it was the Lyric Opera of Chicago, who produced it last November starring Lisette Oropesa and Lawrence Brownlee, affording me the opportunity to add a live production to my dataset. So that, in short, is this video's ludicrous premise. 3 productions of Pelly's Régiment, 2 filmed and 1 live, spanning 16 years, all watched within 36 hours of each other. How different could they possibly be? Now, before we get too far into this, I want to acknowledge the previous scholarship on the practice of filming opera productions, both for television, as has been done since the 1950s, and the recent burst of recordings following the launch of the Met Opera's Live in HD series in 2006. Lots of ink has been spilt on the phenomenology of live casting, how the Met positions its recordings as sufficiently live, the inclusion of paratexts like interviews and backstage footage, and the sociological difference between watching in a movie theater versus an opera house. This is all a fascinating discussion, and I will be touching briefly on the Auslander versus Phelan debates around liveness later in this video, but that's not my main focus. While I've attended Live in HD screenings before, both of the videos I relied on for this project were archival, available for streaming on the Royal Opera and Met Opera websites. My practice was as follows. On November 13th, 2023, I watched both the 2007 and 2019 recordings back-to-back in my apartment. Then, on November 14th, I went to the Lyric Opera of Chicago and watched the production in person. So, for the purposes of this video, I won't be commenting on the liveness of opera cinema, and will be considering them as static recordings of Pelly's dynamic 2007 staging. For more on the static dynamic terminology, watch the Drowsy Chaperone video. The concern of this video is also not about declaring one of these productions to be better than the other, or enforcing the primacy of live opera over its mediatized editions. The root of this video is the following hypothetical. I, an audience member, want to watch Laurent Pelly's 2007 staging of La Fille de Régiment. All three artworks discussed here are being considered as methods of satisfying that want. And, owing to the tools of their medium and the attendant assumptions about the goals of a live stream or production, the resulting impressions of what Pelly's Régiment is are not wholly the same. But we should also jump back a bit more. For the uninitiated, here is a ludicrously abbreviated summary of the plot of La Fille de Régiment. Don't blink. The 21st Regiment of the French Army is encamped in the Tyrolean Mountains. The regiment, led by a sergeant named Sulpice, also includes Marie, their canteen girl, a foundling who was adopted as an infant by the entire regiment collectively. While in the mountains, Marie meets a Tyrolean named Tonio, and the two quickly fall in love. However, a noblewoman, the Marquise de Berkenfield, is traveling in the area, and upon meeting Sulpice, discovers that Marie is her long-lost niece. Meeting Marie and finding her to be too unladylike, the Marquise demands she return home with her. At that moment, Tonio returns, having enlisted in the French army himself, just in time to see Marie leave him. In Act 2, set in the Marquise's chateau, Marie fails repeatedly to be a demure lady, reverting to her old regimental ways. As she despairs about being soon married off, the 21st Regiment shows up at the castle, and Tonio formally proposes to her. When the Marquise rejects his proposal, he reveals the secret he has kept from everyone. Marie is not the niece of the Marquise, but her illegitimate daughter. Just as Marie is about to be pressured into marriage to someone else, the regiment invades the castle, revealing Marie's former life as a canteen girl and scandalizing the guests. Marie sings of her debt of gratitude to the soldiers, which finally turns the Marquise's heart, and she allows Marie and Tonio to be married. As mentioned, the three productions I watched featured entirely different casts, save for the single exception of Alessandro Corbelli, who happened to play Sulpice in both the 2007 recording and the 2023 lyric staging, meaning I watched him perform the same role 16 years apart, 24 hours apart. But this was an intentional choice. This isn't a video about how these singers interpret the roles. This is a video about how they are framed by their productions and recordings. So let's get into the how. A couple of general trends immediately distinguish the proshots from each other. The 2007 recording relies on a greater number of long takes and mid-range shots, and the editing of the 2019 recording can often feel frenetic by comparison. While the Royal Opera generally keeps the focus on the principal singers when they're on screen, the Met adds more reaction shots from side characters, panning shots over the ensemble, and camera angles from positions that do not correspond at all to seats in the house. The 2023 lyric production featured effectively only one unbroken camera angle, and given the placement of my seat, the view looked like this. While the specificity of performer facial expressions may have been lost, the consistency of viewpoint did mean I was better able to note the composition of scenic elements across Pelly's staging, and the reaction of audience members in my immediate vicinity. But let's get into the nitty-gritty. Let's do some direct compare-contrasts. Marie's aria "C'en est donc fait" is a good place to start. The 2007 Royal Opera recording shows the entire aria in 5 shots, with the meat of the song consisting of just 2, both mid-range shots focused on Marie. Compare this to the 2019 Met Opera recording, which uses 20 shots for the same aria, including frequent cuts between different angles despite Marie being the only singer on stage. While there are still many long takes, certain moments are broken up further by alternating between wides and close-ups. During the number, Marie takes out these objects, given to her by the regiment in Act 1. The editing of the Met Opera recording emphasizes 3 of the objects, the helmet, bear, and flower, while in the Royal Opera recording, all objects are given equal prominence by virtue of this single unbroken shot. The variance gets more pronounced when we look at a duet. Across the first half of Au Bruit de la Guerre, there's a difference of 11 shots to 31 shots, with Marie's first stanza alone featuring only 3 shots in 2007 compared to 15 in 2019. And even then, 2007's first stanza only counts as 3 shots due to a single reaction of Sulpice in the middle, the only reaction in the whole song. 2019 features 4 reaction shots, and further spices up the composition by occasionally cutting from one shot of a character to another shot of the same character. And while 2007 only utilizes wide shots for moments when both characters are singing, and thus both need to be filmed, 2019 intersperses wide shots throughout the segment, regardless of who's singing. Perhaps the greatest contrast when it comes to the use of long takes is the second act trio, Toutes les Trois Réunies. While the 2019 recording uses 44 shots to film the song, the 2007 recording uses only 5, including one monster 76-second unbroken take to film the entire first half, a length of music that covers 30 shots of the 2019 recording. The editing in 2019 also more clearly reflects the spirit of the number, including this beat at the start of the song when these 3 spotlights click on, the hard borders of the light matching the vaudevillian vibe of the song and staging. While both recordings focus on the singers, since there's not much going on with the grander stage picture, 2007 relies on follow shots that track the performers around the stage, while 2019 cuts quickly between close-ups on all 3, better matching the bouncy tone of the music. Moving on from the use of long takes, there are also moments where the decisions on where to add close-ups explicitly shape what information the viewer is given. During Tonio's aria to convince the Marquise of his love, Marie's blocking includes her crossing her fingers behind her back. This is visible in both filmed versions, though the 2007 makes it especially explicit with this shot. I can confirm that Marie put her hands behind her back at the lyric opera, but I couldn't see the crossed fingers, and if I hadn't been looking for it, I might not have noticed at all. That said, this is a case where the Royal Opera recording's restraint is very much in its favor. While the 2019 recording features regular cutting to different angles on Tonio, as well as the Marquise's reactions, Marie's reactions are seen from behind, with only one shot showing her face. 2007, meanwhile, has fewer shots, but the focus on Tonio in the first half gives way to a wider variety of shots in the second, including framing that explicitly shows off both Tonio and Marie's reactions, reconfiguring the song not just as Tonio singing to the Marquise, but him reasserting his love to Marie. And while the 2019 ends on a close-up of Camarena, the 2007 ends on this incredible shot, allowing the whole trio's reactions to be captured. Further muddled by the camera is a moment early in the show, when the Marquise's manservant, Hortensius, meets Sulpice for the first time. The joke here in the text is that Hortensius is preparing to fight the next soldier he sees, only to deflate the instant he sees Sulpice. But in 2007, the camera cuts to Sulpice when Hortensius notices him, missing his reaction shot. Hello, monsieur! Contrasting this, in 2019, the camera shows Sulpice earlier, but a shot with both of them switches to a close-up at the punchline, showing only Hortensius' reaction. Hello, monsieur, comment allez-vous? Even at a distance, this moment works cleaner on stage, where the mutual discovery of the other character can be watched all at once, despite the distance between them. It's not just the distance from the performers that's notable, but also the ability of the camera frame to choose what gets emphasized, a tool not necessarily available to the in-person production. Consider this moment when the regiment exits the stage, but Sulpice has 3 extra lines of dialogue with Marie. The 2007 and 2023 productions frame this about the same, as one small moment hanging off the end of the larger exit of the soldiers. But 2019 separates it and lends it prominence by virtue of this over-the-shoulder shot, framing the moment as a turning point in the relationship between the two of them. Only in 2019 did I clock that this is the moment, ahead of Tonio and Marie's love duet, where she chooses him over the rest of the regiment. For her character, a point of no return. But sometimes the decision to cut out stage business can simplify a number drastically. During that subsequent love duet, this large drop featuring 2 lovers comes down behind Marie and Tonio, a moment of explicit parallelism. But while the 2007 includes a close-up on the drop that pans down to the singers, and the 2019 cuts to a wide shot to show it flying in, both eventually recenter the singers for the last stanza of the song, making the screen picture not altogether different than how the number looked at the start. Contrasting this is the in-person experience, where the drop's omnipresence throughout the number, even as the singers move away from it, constitutes its own kind of framing. With so few scenic changes, it serves to underscore this love duet as unique within the world of the show, and it grants Marie's relationship to Tonio a visual distinction from her earlier duet with Sulpice. highlighted in all versions when Sulpice is the one to re-enter and push the drop back into the rafters. Oh no! This ability for the cinematography to affect focus can be seen most prominently in the opera's most famous aria, Ah Mes Amis. Despite the final segment of the number featuring only a solo vocalist, the staging includes the full regiment standing on stage behind Tonio, a choice that all three versions frame differently. In 2007, the focus remains almost entirely on Tonio, only showing the soldiers during their brief vocal interjections and one moment when they are choreographed to swing their heads. Aside from highlighting these two details, which are the same places where Pelly's staging draws attention to the soldiers, the number reads entirely as a solo. And interestingly, while the 2023 production keeps the soldiers in frame the whole time, the effect is much the same. Their relatively static physicality allows the viewer to filter them out, save for the moments when they draw attention, keeping the focus resolutely on Tonio. Contrast this with 2019. While Tonio is still undeniably the focus, there are more shots that capture the reaction of the soldiers to his aria. We see them turn around to watch him, their shock after the head shakes, and more shots that frame Tonio in the foreground with the rest in the background. The aria then becomes not just about Tonio's joy, but the regiment's corresponding disappointment to be losing Marie. These are reactions that could be seen in the in-person staging of the opera, but they're certainly given greater prominence through the proshot. This all gets us closer to that question of why these changes matter. While these are small adjustments and not ones that fundamentally alter Pelly's blocking, they have the effect of altering the story of the opera as the viewer understands it. Take, for instance, Marie's regimental song. Tonio's pitiable attempts to join in on the number are highlighted in the Met Opera recording by continually cutting back to him, at moments when his antics are happening far to the side of the stage. They're notable in 2023, but made prominent in 2019. But in the Royal Opera recording, they're not seen at all. That recording keeps the focus exactly where Pelly placed it, with mid-range shots of Marie and the regiment that keep Tonio off camera, just as they're doing in the staging itself. How to read these different views of the same staging? Pelly's blocking is designed to frame Tonio as an outsider, not yet fully accepted by the regiment or Marie. 2007 highlights this by exclusion, by literally placing him outside the frame, and 2019 does so through inclusion, by making his presence known and clearly treated as an interruption of the dominant stage action. Another moment where the framing changes the story told by the same blocking is Marie's Act 1 aria, Il faut partir. As Marie walks down the line of soldiers, they hand her small objects, presumably from her time serving them as canteen girl. But is this moment of parting supposed to focus on Marie or the soldiers? Or both? The Royal Opera makes its perspective clear with a single long shot following Marie down the line, in which the soldiers' hands emerge disembodied from the crowd, and most of their heads are cut out by the frame. For the most part, the individual soldiers fade away, becoming one collective unit. The Met Opera, by contrast, intersperses repeated close-ups on Marie with separate shots showing the soldiers' reactions, and makes sure each person handing her an object is captured with equal prominence. The 2023 lyric opera performance was naturally closer to the 2007 in framing, but by watching from a higher, consistent angle, the physical expression of their anguish came across more clearly than in either filmed version. Far from a single mob, the effect is a huddled group of individuals, turning towards each other and having their own reactions to Marie's departure. And then there's the one element that every opera live cast must wrestle with. How do you acknowledge the audience? The opportunity for direct comparison comes at the end of Ah Mes Amis, a song that carries a reputation for tenors to perform encores. And with encores being dictated by applause, the moment brings a certain tension. Will an encore occur or not? Can the audience clap loud enough to make it happen? In the lyric performance, Lawrence Brownlee did in fact give an encore, and it was electrifying to clap along with the audience and encourage him to make it happen. Even before he started the song again, the thrill of that moment undeniably came more from the audience than it did from the staging. The 2019 performance also featured an encore, the first in Live in HD history it turns out, and so the moment of extended, unplanned applause is similarly transformed into a moment to highlight the audience, with sweeping shots showing individual patrons standing up. And as for Camarena himself, close-ups on his face allow the viewer to witness his own joy as he weighs the chances of doing an encore in real time. And while the 2007 performance doesn't feature an encore, the moment is still highlighted as extraordinary by cutting to this shot, the only camera angle in the entire recording that captures both the performer and audience at the same time. In this way, all three versions are able to highlight the response to this particular aria as exceptional, compared to the rest of the applause breaks. Although, for what it's worth, neither film version can capture my favorite detail of the in-person applause break at the lyric, that being the moment, just as Brownlee launched into his encore, that the older woman sitting across from me immediately took out her phone and texted someone, presumably to brag about an encore having happened. The magic of live theater. So, with all that evidence laid out, let's take a broader look at things. Each of these is a different way of experiencing Laurent Pelly's staging of Régiment, and each clearly has their own perspective and focus on what is most important to capture about Pelly's staging. The 2007 Royal Opera recording seems more content to let the production stand on its own, with the simplified camera work more prone to getting out of the way. Longer, unbroken shots throughout are better matched to the in-house viewing experience, although the general composition of shots prioritizes the principal singers over the larger stage pictures or ensemble chorus, except in moments when they most clearly take focus over the leads. I might refer to this recording as more clinical and score-focused, with the intention of letting the beauty of the music and virtuosity of the performances take center stage. The 2019 Met Opera live cast, by contrast, features more shots overall and quicker cuts between them, for a more energetic viewing experience, even in moments when the blocking calls for the characters to remain still. I would describe this recording as more story and character focused, prioritizing moments when characters react to the turns of the narrative and capturing details so small they might be missed by an audience member in the balcony. That said, the increased focus on Tonio and the occasional didactic decisions to throw focus to certain moments does raise the open question of whether the recording is, for lack of a better term, faithful to the in-person experience. And remember, this video is not about picking one of these recordings as the best way to watch La Fille de Régiment. All three of our subjects here, the two recordings and the one live performance, all count as ways to watch Laurent Pelly's staging, but owing to differences in their mediums and attentions, the audience experience watching all three is subtly different. And there's a conclusion to the video that could be drawn at this point, that what's proved by this little experiment is the dynamicism inherent to opera itself, and stagings of opera more specifically. That what constitutes Pelly's Régiment is as much open to interpretation as it is defined by staging and score. Though all three can equally claim the title of being the staging, none are the same, and none are definitive. Even the 2007 production, directed by Laurent Pelly himself, is the same staging as the 2019 and 2023 productions, both helmed by revival director Christian Reth. It's only natural that all three examples here would differ. Even beyond the recordings, the 2007 Royal Opera production, 2019 Met Opera production, and 2023 Lyric Opera production of the same staging cannot be expected to be perfect mirrors of each other. But with that said, there's still the question of why the recordings make these cinematography choices, of why the focus is shifted towards singers in one and characters in the other, of why an audience member may prefer a wide shot over a series of close-ups. And this why speaks, of course, to a much wider division in opera tastes. See, many of these conversations around framing and shot composition are relevant to any filmed theater production, not just opera. John Wyver, producer of the Royal Shakespeare Company's Live from Stratford-upon-Avon series, details exactly these distinctions in an excellent 2015 article about the practice. He hits on many of the same points, details of the staging that are lost in the translation to the screen, the prioritization of subtle facial expressions over the wider stage picture, and the resulting ways the live cast guides the audience to focus on details in a manner not possible in person. And Emanuele Sinici, in an indispensable 2010 article, argues that the metric that most stage recordings are measured by is a kind of fidelity to the intention of the stage director. In a musicological context, the highest praise to which a video can aspire is to not have betrayed the live performance. In any case, the video is almost exclusively conceived as a replica of a performance. What happens live is the work of art, the video its mechanical reproduction. But my choice to discuss an opera in this video wasn't random. There's a divide amongst opera goers, both artists and audiences alike, about what the purpose of opera is, and which elements of an opera a recording should aspire not to betray. And, unlike Shakespeare, to film an opera at all requires taking a stance on one side of that divide. In my experience, there are few opera aficionados who will claim that story is completely disregardable in opera. The goal of communicating a narrative through music is one of the elements separating opera from other classical music forms, like symphonies or choruses. But while the presence of a story is a defining part of opera, it remains an open question how much audiences should be expected to follow that story. When we attend an opera, what are we really there for? The plot or the music? Now, this is an enormous question that would require another month of research and tack another 30 minutes onto the video, so let's save that for another time. All we need to acknowledge at this juncture is that a middle ground exists between Mozart's The Magic Flute, with its incomprehensible narrative set to perfectly structured music, and Terence Blanchard's Champion, with a jazzy and arrhythmic score that befits its complex human story. When it comes to placing priority on narrative or musicality, not all operas are created equal. And not all productions of the same opera are created equal. Some productions of Così fan tutte will make an effort to apply believable acting beats to the inconstancy of the female leads, and others won't even bother. Look at the Met's most recent two stagings of Così in 1996 and 2018 for that contrast. So then, let's narrow our focus back to Régiment, and to Pelly's staging of Régiment specifically. If you were to watch just one of the filmed editions of the staging, you'd probably come away with different opinions on what Pelly, as director, prioritizes. 2007's Royal Opera recording is comparatively music-focused, with its more static cinematography that films entire arias without cutaways. This recording was directed for the screen by Robin Lowe, who has since gone on to a prolific career in livecasts, working with the National Theatre and RSC to this day. Quoted in Wyver's article mentioned earlier, Lowe described his role as such: "The broadcast process should, as far as was feasible, remain invisible and unacknowledged. Sometimes people say, well, why don't you have a shot looking the other way, out towards the audience? And I say, well, A, it draws attention to itself, and B, that's not what the director staged." The 2019 Met Opera recording, comparatively, is much more filmic in its construction, capturing moments that audiences might miss and doing so with camera angles unavailable from any seat. Its director, Gary Halvorson, has helmed live in HD recordings since the very first livecast in 2006, and prior to that as a long history as a television director, including nearly a quarter of the run of Friends. On the music versus story question, 2019 leans much more heavily in the direction of narrative, eschewing the grander stage picture at times in favor of close-ups and reactions, and mimicking the energy of each scene through the cinematography. This may be my own projection, but as I see it, the difference is this. When the 2007 recording films a close-up of Juan Diego Flores, the hope is that the viewer will see Flores. But when the 2019 recording films a close-up of Javier Camarena, the hope is that the viewer will see Tonio. And therein lies the difference. Further underlining the idea that the Royal Opera recording represents a more traditional view of opera cinema techniques is its release. It was not streamed into theaters like the Met, but filmed for DVD release by Virgin Classics, the now defunct branch of Virgin Records that handled classical releases. Unlike Live in HD, which the Met touts as part of their larger efforts to make opera accessible to a wider audience, the type of viewers buying Virgin Classics DVDs in 2007 might be assumed to be more broadly familiar with opera, and therefore more interested in a viewing experience that, citing Lowe, remains invisible and unacknowledged. With all that said, however, I should counteroffer that with regards to music and story, neither of the filmed editions of the staging are prioritizing one to the detriment of the other. Viewers of the Royal Opera recording will still clearly see the story of Marie Antonio unfold, and viewers of the Met Opera recording will still be treated to an excellent performance of the score. This is all about focus, how the tools of the livecast medium can help sway audiences to understand the production in one way or another, of communicating the recording's own perspective about what the purpose of an opera recording is, and what it should be faithful to capturing. But, as Senichi acknowledges in the opening of his article, some audiences would prefer a recording with no perspective at all. I would like always to see everything on stage, please. My own eyes will follow and focus as required. Would that they had one camera angle only, fixed somewhere in the house to broadcast the production exactly as a live audience sees it. The fancy camera work, zooming, hovering, etc., is sometimes visually interesting, but it detracts from the experience. The camera thinks for me, and decides for me where my interests lay, and I don't appreciate that. So much is lost when a camera zooms in. This quote, an anonymous comment on an article announcing that the Met 2008 broadcast of Salome would not include a moment of nudity present in the stage version, speaks to a larger point around opera livecasts. If a livecast of a stage production will inevitably require a certain amount of editorial perspective from the director and film crew, does a recording only serve to further cement the status of the live performance as the truer, more legitimate work of art? Put more simply, do the limitations of a livecast serve to make the in-person show look better? Philip Oslander's landmark work Liveness from 1999 puts forward the argument that, in an increasingly media-centric world, the supposed primacy of live performance over its recorded replicas is increasingly tenuous. Rather than considering the former superior to the latter, we should consider the two as synonymous with each other. One work of art in two forms, one live and one mediatized. James Steichen, writing about the Live in HD series in 2011, applies this theory to opera specifically. The HD transmissions seem an inevitable fulfillment of Philip Oslander's claims, arguing that the category of the live does not inhere ontologically in the act of performance, but is rather a historical after-effect of the mediatization of performance events. In other words, until there was a way of experiencing them via a medium that did not entail showing up at the original event in person, no one thought of them as live per se. If Gelb and the Met were not reading Oslander's work, they nevertheless seemed to be taking him as their playbook. I can see where this perspective is coming from, but I would argue the effect is more complicated. Yes, as stated before, I think all three of the artworks being discussed here can serve as methods of watching Laurent Pelly's La Fille de Régiment, if that's the goal of the viewer. But the inherent limitations of the two mediatized recordings, the inevitability that the camera will end up thinking for me, do provide a distinction in how the viewer encounters them. The ability to choose. Because that, in brief, is the element most unique to seeing a performance in person, and my own experience of watching the 2023 lyric opera performance. It was only from the distance of the 6th floor balcony that I was able to appreciate how Pelly's staging already shapes the audience's focus. The recordings both keep attention on Marie during Il Faut Partir by capturing her in close-up, but the staging does so naturally by simply having her be the only moving character on stage. Her loneliness is highlighted on film during C'en est donc fait by cutting to a momentary shot of her against an empty stage before returning to focus on her. In person, the eye focuses naturally, first recognizing the emptiness of the stage as a solo number follows a three-person scene, then returning to Marie when it becomes clear no one else will enter. In person, Tonio's dancing along during Regimental Song is off to the side and easily missable, but if you happen to look over to him, it serves as an interruption of the main action, much more so than cutting to show his actions explicitly or refusing to put him on camera at all. The audience members who came to the opera house to hear Donizetti's score could ignore all this narrative-driven action and keep a soft focus on the stage as a whole while these singers were singing. And audiences who came to watch a story about Marie and Tonio had the ability to view any part of the stage at any time. No camera thought for us. I find myself, in discussing this, reconsidering the intentions of opera cinematography more broadly. Throughout this video, I've described how the tools of film can serve to highlight or underline or focus or emphasize moments in La Fille de Régiment. But in saying that, are we suggesting perhaps that Pelly's staging is insufficient at doing so on its own? Are we assuming that the at-home viewing audience requires more filmic techniques in order to enjoy the opera than in-person audiences do? Is the stage language insufficient? Would it be more respectful to opera as a medium to film its works from the single audience-level camera angle suggested by that anonymous commenter? Well, I wouldn't go that far, because the notion that one should be respectful to the staging contains its own opinion, in the same vein as Robin Lowe's invisible and unacknowledged statement before. It reiterates the idea that in-person viewing is truer or purer than at-home viewing. Again, my goal is not to proclaim one of these three versions of the opera as better than the others. Instead, my intention here is that these three methods of viewing Laurent Pelly's La Fille de Régiment reflect their own intentions, and that is a value-neutral statement. All three are the Pelly staging, and yet all three are unique in the tools they use to represent it. The astute viewer shouldn't look at them as interchangeable, but also shouldn't see the live performance as innately more artistic than its mediatized counterparts. This is why I've continued throughout this video to refer to the trio as artworks, each their own unique, but nested, experience for the viewer. And isn't that true of all opera? This video has focused on Pelly's staging, but consider that there is no version of Régiment that is divorced from staging. Every production of the opera was created by someone, was brought into being through that person's perspective and priority. You're worried about someone thinking for you? The director already did that. The thinking is coming from inside the opera house. As a dynamic work of art, Donizetti's opera only exists if someone is producing it. In the same vein, Pelly's staging only exists if someone is performing it. In a sense, the 2007 recording isn't exactly of La Fille de Régiment. It's a recording of a performance, of a production, of a staging of La Fille de Régiment. And like it or not, preferring the live performance over the recorded live cast only removes the last link in that chain. As Oslander argues, mediatization is a process we only recognize when we have an original work to compare it to. For dynamic works of art, however, mediatization is the only way to watch at all. Otherwise, we'd be coming to an opera house and staring at a printed score. Let me be real for a moment. As a video essayist, I deal with static representations of dynamic artworks all the time. The Randy Feltface video involved attending one performance in person and watching 5 stand-up specials on film. The Cat in the Hat video was based entirely on a recording of the show from 9 years before I watched it. Hell, the Life with Father video didn't even use a recording of the stage show, but its film adaptation. Analyzing the performing arts in this format requires, and is largely possible because of, the use of mediatized editions of live performance. But for as much as I rely on them, I also acknowledge that these recordings are not replacements, and are not definitive, and I don't treat them as such. The Drowsy Chaperone video commented on the writing of Man in Chair, but not Bob Martin's performance, as that's not part of the performance text. The Toruk video stuck to analyzing the narrative and stagecraft, but the intricacies of the in-house experience were largely left out. This medium of discussion requires a perspective on proshots that I hope all audiences will hold, that they are never a replacement for the experience of watching in person, and they are a hugely helpful resource for those who cannot watch in person. Daniel Meyer-Dinkgraef, in a 2015 article comparing Oslander's work with that of his most prominent critic, Peggy Phelan, asserts that the appeal of live performance lies in the communication of pure consciousness, what is more casually known as the energy in the room, or the magic of theater. This is gonna get a little metaphysical, but stick with me here. In Meyer-Dinkgraef's words, the physiology of the brain is the complex tool that permits that experience. Through their creations at all levels, humans can also directly give expression to pure consciousness if a dramatist creates a play or an actor creates a character. This act of creation implies imbuing the created work with pure consciousness. Consequently, the more pure consciousness the actors are able to integrate into their acting, and the more the spectators can experience it, the more enjoyable the experience will be for both. The art form of theater has particular potential for allowing those involved in it, actors and spectators, to reach intensive experiences of pure consciousness, more intensive than in other areas of life. That's a lot of terms, so let's simplify that down. The magic of theater, by virtue of its in-person nature, can never be perfectly replicated on film. But far from being a reason not to record stage productions, I assert emphatically that this is the reason we should be recording more stage productions. In many of the articles about the explosion of live casts since the late 2000s, there's a persistent hand-wringing about whether the increased availability of theater on film will undercut ticket sales, or make the experience less valuable if you can just watch it at home. I reject these fears outright. If we really care about this art form, and believe in the magic of theater to be a real notion, then it should be obvious that no recording can replace the in-person experience. Rather, the recording becomes its own unique experience, able to stir an audience response of its own, distinct from the original work of art, but forever tethered to it. If an audience member watching the live in HD broadcasts wants to experience pure consciousness, the only way of doing so is by coming in person, and it always will be. But if a viewer wants to see Laurent Pelly's La Fille de Régiment, then the recording exists, not as a replacement, but as documentation, as the mediatized static edition of a dynamic artwork that allows some shadow of its ephemerality to persist. Beyond opera, discussions around proshots can get unnecessarily bogged down in what it is they're capturing. The Royal Opera filmed one performance in 2007 and labeled it as the opera, but don't we do the same ourselves if we only watch one performance? Perhaps if we could normalize the concept of stage productions existing dynamically, not as a series of artistic decisions, but as a series of artistic actions, we could let go of the anxiety around filmed versions somehow supplanting their in-person counterparts, and allow them to stand beside each other, nested but distinct. The definition of what Laurent Pelly's La Fille de Régiment is an open question, and the 2007 and 2019 recordings are just two answers out of many. So long as it keeps being performed, the answer will be different for every production, for every performance, and for every person that sees it. But hey, not everyone can see the show in person. Better then, that they get to enjoy a recording and watch one answer to that question.